Simple Cove is sponsored by Bits & Bits Company. Use coupon code SIMPLECOVE15 to save 15% on your next order. If you're like me, you love the look of dovetails in your work, but you hate just how long it takes you to cut them. You know, I only get about an hour or so out here during the week, and during the weekend, I don't want to be sitting there and cutting dovetails all weekend because I like to make progress on my projects. So when I made the Bubinga cabinet, I decided to make a couple of jigs that are going to make this process repeatable and a whole lot faster. This is the dovetail jig that I made for cutting the tails at the bandsaw. It's really simple, piece of plywood, stop block, and it's going to give you repeatable cuts. This is the second jig that you're going to use for the router to ride across the top, and it's going to remove a majority of the waste on the sockets. These two jigs were made using some 3/4 scrap plywood and a couple of stop blocks. Really simple to make. This video is going to show you how to make these, and hopefully you can get to cutting some dovetails in your projects. To begin, I'm going to show you how to make this jig to turn your bandsaw into a dovetail cutting machine. But honestly, all we're doing is using a scrap piece of 3/4 inch ply, and I make a mark using my bevel gauge to set the same angle as my 1:6 dovetail marker. Next, I take the board over to the bandsaw and make the cut, trying to stay on the line. To clean up the rough sawn edge, I run it over the joiner a couple of times. This is going to get me extremely close to the same angle as the dovetail marker. I glue and screw a little piece of wood to act as a stop for the boards that I'm cutting. The drawer stock material for the sides is 1/2 inch maple, and it's roughly 4 inches wide. I've left these boards longer than they need to be just in case you mess up. To give you a second and third try to get this right. The drawer front is 7/8 of an inch thick Bubinga. On the drawer fronts, when you're doing half-blind dovetails, I like to make the tails a little bit taller because if you do 1/2 inch tails, they just look a little short. So I like to make the drawer front material 7/8 of an inch, so that way I can make the tails 5/8 of an inch thick. The next thing that I did was set a marking gauge to 5/8 of an inch. And again, that's going to give us our depth line, so when we're cutting at the bandsaw, we'll know where to stop. So I'm going to go, since this is the tail board, I'm going to go all the way around, including on the edges on both boards. Now I'm only doing one end because the other end I'm not doing dovetails. I'm going to be doing a sliding dovetail. So if you're doing dovetails in the front and the back, you're going to want to change this depending on the stock that you're using for the back. If you're using another 1/2 inch board for through dovetails, you'll probably want to set this to 1/2 of an inch. To lay out the dovetail, it's pretty simple. I'm going to lay out a 1/2 pin on each end. And on this, I'm just going to split the difference and make 2 tails. So I'm going to find rough center. And what we have essentially is 2 big tails. Now we're going to lay this out to be cut on the bandsaw. And my bandsaw has a fairly aggressive blade in it for resawing. So I need to put the space between the tails right around 1/4 of an inch. And if you don't, and you have a large blade, what's going to happen is it's going to clip the corner of your tails. If you had a finer blade in, you could get away with that being smaller. But to play it safe, I'm going to put 1/8 of an inch on each side of my center line. And now I'm just going to use this 1:6 dovetail marker to lay out the tails. And we got the dovetail jig that we made earlier, and all I'm going to do is get it sort of close, and you want to make sure that your piece is butted up against that stop, and it's just a matter of lining it up. And the good thing is, after you make one cut, we're going to rotate the board and make the second cut. And before you move this fence, grab your second piece that's off to the side and cut the same thing and flip it. That way you only have to set this up once for both pieces, or if you had 2 or 3 or 4 drawers, you can batch them out. When making the cut, I take it all the way down to the scribe line. It may appear difficult, but just slow down when you get close and you can get it right to your line. If you don't feel comfortable taking it down to the line, don't forget you can always remove the waste using your chisel. Now I just need to move the fence again and line it up with my line and repeat the same thing. And here are the dovetails. Got them on both boards. The angle is consistent. The spacing is perfect. I could have gone smaller on this center channel here. It's just a matter of me not truly understanding or knowing how thick the kerf is on the bandsaw. This is something you'll figure out the more of these that you cut, but for now, this looks pretty good. Just got to remove some waste, and to do that, we're going to go over to the table saw. Since we have our scribe line from earlier, just got to line it up with the kerf and then set the fence. And this is going to allow me to flip it over and remove the waste from the other side. I've removed the half pin waste using the chisel after taking it to the crosscut sled because there was just a little bit of waste left to remove. Next, I used my bow saw to remove the waste in between the two tails. Next, using a 1/4 inch chisel, I start to remove the waste between the dovetails. To do this, I stay in front of my scribe line until I've got roughly about a 1/16 of an inch left, and then I put the chisel in the scribe line. You'll notice that when I'm chiseling the waste, I only go down about halfway, and then I flip the board over and remove the rest of the waste from the other side. Next, I've got this dovetail alignment board, and what that's going to do is help me line up the tails accurately on the pin board. And it's going to do that because it's got a couple of fences to keep everything perfectly aligned. And I forgot to mention, I got a couple of stickers on here to quickly identify which of the edges need to line up. With the board clamped in the Moxon vise, I traced the tails onto the drawer front using a marking knife, or perhaps even a box cutter. Second little jig that I have is just a couple pieces of 3/4 plywood glued together with a rabbet cut on it and a little fence. And this is going to allow me to butt it up against the workpiece like this. And it's going to be flush with the surface, and it's going to support the router, so that way I can remove the waste and support the router. I'm going to be removing the waste using an 1/8 of an inch compression bit in my trim router. After each pass, I'll lower the bit about 1/8 of an inch until I get to the thickness of the side panels, and that's about 1/2 of an inch. And if you're curious as to why I used an 1/8 of an inch bit instead of something larger, it's just so that I could get closer up in the corners to remove more waste. You're left with a little bit of chiseling, but not much. But the important thing is look how crisp those bottoms are. Perfectly straight. They're all the same exact depth, and came out perfect. So now we're going to remove some waste with a chisel. While you're chiseling, you have the potential to blow out the front of the sockets since there's not a whole lot of meat left on the bone. So what I do is I clamp the jig back into place, and this is going to help support that while I'm chiseling. Finally, we can chisel away the waste, starting with removing the waste in front of your scribe line. I like to remove as much waste as possible before putting the chisel in that scribe line because that's going to prevent the waste from pushing your chisel back and throwing your line off. With the waste cleared, I can tap the board into place to see how it fits. Now let's check out the completed drawer. These are the half-blind dovetails that I cut using the jigs, and as you can see, they came out great. And the back is a little different compared to what I normally make for drawer boxes. As you can see, this rear panel is narrower than the sides, and that's to allow this bottom panel to expand and contract. And the bottom panel is solid wood. It has a slot cut in it and a screw to hold it down, so this is going to allow it to expand and contract. And as you can see, it's underneath this back panel. The back panel is held in place using sliding dovetails, so it's locked in place. That combined with the half blinds in the front, this thing is going to outlast me. So I hope you enjoyed the video. These two jigs are something I think you're going to want to add to your shop. I say that in almost every video that I show you how to make a jig, but it's true. I'm only sharing jigs in these videos that I find extremely useful, and especially this one. I can't tell you how much time this saved me and how much accuracy it brought versus hand cutting the dovetails. This in combination with the bandsaw, really awesome. And this with using a trim router and a compression bit or some sort of straight bit, it removed a majority of the waste from the sockets and saved me a lot of time as well. So with these two jigs, I think you'll be making dovetails, especially half-blind dovetails, in no time. If you liked the video, leave me a comment below and let me know what you think, and hit the thumbs up button. And don't forget, if you're not subscribed, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. That will do it for this one. I'll see you in the next build video.